Some things don't have explanations. And some people who have spent their entire careers inside these forests, still can't tell you what they saw. These are not ghost stories. These are not legends passed around a campfire. These are reports, filed by real rangers, real search teams, real people who knew these mountains better than they knew their own backyards. And every single one of them will tell you the same thing. Something is out there in the Appalachian wilderness that doesn't belong. Something that doesn't show up on any map. Something that doesn't respond when you call out. Something that waits. 12 rangers, 12 forests, 12 encounters that ended careers, haunted dreams, and left official reports marked with 2 words nobody wants to see. Cause unknown. Stay with the lights on. Because once you hear what these rangers found out there in the dark, you're going to think twice before you ever walk into a forest alone again. This is Story 1. Story 1. I've spent 22 years in these mountains. I've seen bear attacks, I've pulled bodies out of ravines, I've sat through 3-day ice storms with nothing but a hand radio and a propane heater. I stopped getting scared a long time ago. Or at least, that's what I used to tell myself. The night I'm talking about was a Tuesday in late October. The kind of night where the fog sits so low in the hollows you can't see the tree line from the station window. I was the only one on duty. The other ranger, a younger guy named Travis, had taken a sick day, and my supervisor had approved a solo overnight since the weather was too rough for anyone to be out on the trails anyway. The Pisgah station I was stationed at sits at the end of a gravel road, about 11 miles from the nearest paved highway. There's no cell service. There's no neighboring property. There's nothing out there except trees and elevation, and silence so complete it presses against your ears. I had paperwork to finish. Trail closure reports, wildlife activity logs, an incident summary from a lost hiker we'd found the week before. I had coffee. I had a space heater. I thought it was going to be a long, boring, quiet night. At 11:43, I know the exact time because I checked the clock when I heard it, there was a knock at the station door. Not aggressive, not frantic. 3 slow, even knocks. I sat still for a second. My first thought was that Travis had come in after all, feeling better. My second thought was that someone had broken down on the gravel road and hiked out to find help. Both of those things had happened before. Neither of them explained why my stomach immediately went cold. I went to the door and opened it. There was a man standing on the steps. White male, maybe mid-50s. Medium height. He was wearing clean clothes. Not hiker gear, not ranger gear, just ordinary clothes. Dark jacket, jeans. Boots that weren't muddy despite the wet gravel road he would have had to walk 11 miles down to get there. His hair was combed. He looked like someone who had just stepped out of a house. He smiled at me. Not a nervous smile, not a relieved smile, just a steady, patient smile, like he'd been expecting me to open the door. "Evening," he said. "I'm sorry to bother you so late." I told him it was no bother and asked if everything was all right. Standard protocol. You assume car trouble, you assume injury, you assume someone needs help. He said he was fine. He said he just needed to use the phone. I told him we had a landline inside and stepped back to let him in. He came in without hesitation, looked around the station the way you'd look around a room you've been in before. Not curious, just orienting himself. And I pointed him to the desk phone. He picked it up. He dialed. He waited. I was watching him from across the room, filling out a log entry the way we're trained to do when an unknown individual enters the station. Name, time, physical description, reason for visit. When I asked him his name, he said, "Gerald." Just Gerald. No last name offered. He was on the phone for maybe 90 seconds. I couldn't hear what he said because he had his back to me and his voice was low, but it didn't sound distressed. It sounded conversational, like checking in. Then he hung up, thanked me, and walked toward the door. I asked him where he was headed. Standard follow-up. If someone's stranded, you don't just let them walk back into 11 miles of dark mountain road. He said he was fine. He said his ride was coming. I asked him where he'd be waiting. He smiled again, that same patient smile, and said, "Not far." And then he walked out. I heard his footsteps on the gravel for a few seconds, and then I didn't. Here's where I need to be precise about what happened next, because this is the part that I've never been able to explain to anyone's satisfaction, including my own. I waited about 5 minutes, then went outside with a flashlight to check on him. The gravel road was empty in both directions. No car, no figure walking, nothing. The fog was thick, but not thick enough to hide a man standing 30 feet away. I walked 20 yards in each direction. I called out. Nothing. I went back inside and pulled out the station visitor log, because I was going to write up the encounter exactly as it happened. Routine procedure. Then I did something I should have done the moment he walked in. I checked whether we'd had any prior visitor entries for an individual named Gerald, or matching his description. I found one. A single entry, dated 8 years earlier. Night shift. Different ranger. A man named Paul Ostrowski, who retired in 2019. The entry read, "White male, mid-50s, gave name as Gerald, no last name. Requested use of telephone. Departed on foot. No vehicle observed." Same station. Same time of night, 11:40-something. Same description, down to the dark jacket. I called Paul Ostrowski the next morning. He remembered the encounter immediately, said it had bothered him for years, said the man's boots hadn't been muddy either. Neither of us had any explanation for who Gerald was, how he got there, where he went, or why he was still the same age 8 years later. I've worked 3 more years in those mountains since that night. I still do overnight shifts at that station sometimes. I haven't opened the door since, without standing to the side of the frame first. Story 2. People romanticize fire tower duty. They imagine you sitting up there above the canopy with a cup of coffee and a 100-mile view, reading books between cloud formations. And honestly, for the first 3 days of any rotation, it is kind of like that. Then, the isolation sets in. By day 4, you start to notice things. The way certain silences have a quality to them. Not just an absence of sound, but an active, physical pressure. The way the tower sways in wind that you can't feel standing still. The way the dark below you at night isn't just dark, it's layered. I was on my 5th night at Groundhog Mountain when it started. It was October, and the leaves had already turned and dropped in the higher elevations, which meant visibility into the tree line was better than summer, but also meant the forest floor was covered in a 6-inch layer of dry leaves. Rustling carries a long way in those conditions. I'd been awake since 2 in the morning because I'd heard what I thought was a bear moving around the base of the tower. Not unusual. I'd documented 3 separate bear sightings that week, and they sometimes came up to investigate the structure. I leaned out from the catwalk with my flashlight. Nothing. I swept the light around the perimeter. The clearing around the tower base was about 40 feet wide before the tree line. Empty. But the leaves were disturbed in a rough circle around the tower legs. Not a single point of disturbance, but a full ring, like something had walked the entire circumference. Bears don't do that. I went back inside and logged it, chalked it up to wind or animals. I made more coffee. I picked up my radio to check in with the district office and got nothing but static, which happened sometimes at that hour, depending on atmospheric conditions. At 3:15, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not an animal shuffle. Footsteps. two-footed, deliberate, on the leaf-covered ground directly below the tower, moving in a slow circle. I grabbed my flashlight and leaned out over the catwalk railing. The footsteps stopped the instant I moved. I held still. My light reached the ground. Nothing visible in the beam. But I could hear breathing. Not close, not right under me, but somewhere at the edge of the beam's range, just inside the tree line, where the light turned from white to gray. I called out. I identified myself as a U.S. Forest Service ranger and said if someone was out there, they needed to identify themselves. Silence. I went back to my radio and switched to the emergency frequency. This time, I got a partial connection, enough to tell me the signal was going out, but I couldn't confirm whether anyone was receiving. I gave my location and said I had a possible unauthorized presence in the restricted area around the tower. Then the footsteps started again. Still circular, still slow, still two-footed. I timed it. It took approximately 4 minutes for one full circuit around the tower base. I know because it happened 3 more times while I stood on that catwalk with my flashlight and my radio and watched the dark below me. Every time I moved the light toward the sound, the footsteps stopped. The moment I pulled the beam back, they resumed. Whatever was down there knew where my light was pointing. At 4:40, about 90 minutes after it started, the footsteps just stopped. No retreating sounds through the leaves, no branch snapping, no rustling receding into the forest. One moment they were there, completing another circuit. The next moment, silence. When I climbed down at first light to check the perimeter, I found boot prints in the soft mud at the base of the tower. Adult human, deep heel impression, moderate toe, consistent stride length. The prints went around the tower in a circle. I followed them all the way around. They didn't arrive from anywhere. They didn't leave anywhere. They were just there, in a circle, beginning and ending in the same spot of churned mud. I photographed everything and filed an incident report. The district supervisor drove out, looked at the prints, and told me it was probably a local who'd come up to look at the tower at night. Teenagers did that sometimes, he said. I asked him where the approach trail prints were. He didn't have an answer for that. He filed the incident under inconclusive and reassigned me to a different tower for the remainder of the season. I never asked him why he did that. I think I already knew. Story 3. We got the call on a Thursday morning. Solo male hiker, age 31, named Denton Frey, had failed to complete his planned loop through the remote backcountry section of the forest and hadn't returned to his vehicle at the trailhead by the agreed-upon check-in time his wife had set. Standard missing hiker protocol. We had 4 rangers, 2 volunteers, and a search dog team. The weather was overcast but dry. Visibility was decent. We had his last known GPS coordinates from a satellite communicator ping that had gone out at 7:18 the previous evening, about 6 miles from the trailhead. We found Denton Frey at 9:47 on the morning of the second search day. He was sitting on a log beside the trail, approximately 2 miles from his last known position. Upright, fully clothed, gear intact, no visible injuries. This happens sometimes. People get turned around, they bivouac badly, they exhaust themselves and sit down somewhere obvious and just wait. Finding someone alive and uninjured is always the best outcome. We were relieved, but something was wrong. I found a lot of people in these mountains. There's a particular way someone looks after being lost for 30+ hours. Depleted, disoriented, emotional. Some people cry. Some people get angry from the adrenaline crash. Some go completely silent from exhaustion. I've seen all of it. Denton Frey was none of those things. He was calm, completely, evenly calm. Not the calm of someone who has accepted death and made peace with it. Not the calm of shock. Something else. He stood up when he saw us, said, "Hello," in a completely flat tone, and followed directions when I asked him to sit back down for a medical check. His vitals were normal. His hydration was a little low, but not dangerous. His temperature was fine. Our medic found no injuries. I asked him what happened. He said he'd gotten turned around and spent the night in the forest. I asked him where he'd sheltered. He said he hadn't found shelter, that he just waited. I asked him where. He pointed up the trail in the direction we'd come from, back toward the search boundary. I asked him if he'd been there all night. He said yes. Our search teams had covered that section twice the previous afternoon. I didn't push it. People's memories are unreliable after stress, and I wasn't going to interrogate a found hiker. We started moving him toward the trailhead.
The thing that stayed with me isn't what he said. It's the 20-minute walk back to the vehicles. He walked right behind me the entire time. Not beside me, not with the group. Directly behind me, close enough that I could hear his breathing. Every time I glanced back to check on him, his eyes were already on me. Not sweeping the trail, not looking at the trees, not watching his footing on the rocks. Just watching me. About halfway back, one of the volunteers, a young woman named Dana, asked him if he'd heard the search teams calling his name the day before. He said yes. She asked why he hadn't called back. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I wasn't sure it would help." Nobody said anything after that. We walked the rest of the way out in silence. At the trailhead, his wife was waiting. When she saw him, she ran to him. You could see the relief on her face from 50 feet away. He let her hug him. He put his arms around her. But over her shoulder, his face was completely blank. No tears, no relief, no expression at all. She was sobbing. He was just standing there, looking at the tree line. I filed my report and marked the case closed. Found alive, no injuries, cause of disorientation, undetermined. But I gave his wife my direct contact number. I told her to call me if anything seemed off in the days following. I tried to make it sound routine, like something I did for every found hiker. She called me 6 days later. She said Denton had barely spoken since coming home. He sat by windows at night looking out. He'd stopped eating regularly. He'd asked her twice whether she could hear the quiet. Just those words, that phrase. And when she asked him what he meant, he would only say, "You'll know it when it starts." I don't have an explanation for what happened to Denton Frey in that forest for 30 hours. I don't know what he found, or what found him, or whether the man who walked out behind me was entirely the same man who walked in. Some cases you close on paper. You never actually close them.
Story 4.
The Sittons Gulch Connector Trail had been closed for 6 weeks. Landslide had taken out about 40 feet of the path near the second creek crossing, and with the ground still unstable, we'd kept it gated and signed. I'd been out twice that month to remove illegal entry, mostly local teenagers and day hikers who figured the signs didn't apply to them. This particular afternoon, I was doing a standard enforcement sweep. Just me. About 3 miles in, past the closure gate. I want to be clear that I was not the kind of ranger who spooked easy. I'd worked 3 Forest Service districts in 9 years. I dealt with everything from armed illegal campers to a pair of hikers who'd stumbled into what turned out to be the fringes of an active marijuana grow operation. I was not a nervous person. At mile marker 2.7, I heard voices. Not whispering. Actual conversation-level voices,
coming from somewhere off the right side of the trail, back in the trees. Multiple people. I couldn't make out words clearly. The distance was too great, and there was a creak noise competing with it. But the cadence was conversational. Back and forth. Like people sitting around talking. My first thought was exactly what you'd expect. Illegal campers. Second offense campers in closed areas are actually not uncommon in the Nantahala. People go off-trail specifically to avoid rangers. I left the trail and moved toward the voices through the brush. Here's the thing. The voices stayed at the same volume and distance the entire time I was moving toward them. I covered maybe 150 feet of uneven ground, pushing through rhododendron thickets and over downed logs. The voices didn't get louder. They didn't get quieter. They stayed exactly where they seemed to be, somewhere just ahead, just out of clear hearing range. I stopped, called out, identified myself as Forest Service. The voices stopped. I waited 30 seconds. Then I heard them again, from what felt like the exact same distance, but now slightly to my left, as if whatever was making the sound had shifted position the moment I stopped moving. I moved toward them again. Same result, same distance, same indeterminate conversational murmur, pulling just slightly ahead of wherever I was. I did this for maybe 20 minutes. I'm estimating because I lost track of time in a way I'm not totally comfortable admitting. I was focused, irritated. I wanted to find whoever these people were. At some point I realized I had no idea which direction the trail was, not roughly. I mean, I genuinely had lost my orientation. The slope didn't feel right. The creek sound was coming from a different direction than it should have been. The light in the canopy, what was left of it in the late afternoon, didn't indicate the direction I expected west to be. I stopped walking. I made myself stand still, slow my breathing, and use my compass. The compass put the trail approximately 70 degrees east of where my gut was telling me to go. I'd been moving in a wide arc, pulled by those voices, and had rotated almost 90 degrees without realizing it. I went back to the trail. I swept the area with my radio on speaker. That's a tactic we sometimes use to discourage people hiding in brush, because the sound carries and people usually break. Nothing moved. No voices. I walked back to the gate and filed an incident report. Possible unauthorized presence. Confirmed voices. No individual located. No physical evidence found. The report is still sitting in the Nantahala district file marked unresolved. I went back the next morning with a colleague, a ranger named Seth Aldridge. We did a methodical grid search from the spot I'd marked on my GPS. No camp, no fire ring, no footprints in the soft earth near the creek, no trash, no tent marks, no compression in the leaf bed. Seth said it was probably hikers across the ridge on the adjacent open trail, sound bouncing through the valley in a weird way. He said that happens in narrow forest hollows. I didn't say anything. But I've done enough time in hollows to know that sound bounce doesn't follow you. It doesn't stay the same distance while you walk toward it for 20 minutes. It doesn't stop when you call out and start again when you move. Something in that section of closed trail was deliberately keeping itself just beyond the point where I could find it. Whether it was human or something else, and I firmly believe it was human, I still don't know what it wanted, or whether it got what it was looking for while I was stumbling through the brush, chasing a sound that was never quite there. Story 5. My research focus is old-growth forest canopy recovery in post-logging zones. It is, I promise you, Not the kind of work that normally leads to stories like this one. I spend my days measuring tree cores and photographing bark. The most dramatic thing that usually happens to me in the field is a dead GPS battery. I was 3 days into a solo survey in a section of the Monongahela that was genuinely unmapped at the resolution I needed. My permit covered a roughly 4-square-mile area, and I was working a systematic grid. No trails. Off-trail navigation using compass and topo map, the way fieldwork was done before everyone became dependent on satellite units. On the third afternoon, at the far edge of my survey grid, I found a camp. I want to describe it precisely because the details are what made it strange. There were 4 tents. Not cheap modern tents. Old canvas wall tents, the kind hunters sometimes use in the backcountry, heavy-duty and substantial. They were arranged in a square. In the center was a fire ring with a metal grate over it, the kind you have to carry in because there's nothing like it naturally occurring. The fire was cold and had been for some time, maybe days. But the ash was covered, which means someone had put a lid or a board over it deliberately to protect it from rain. There was equipment, folding camp chairs, a heavy wooden table made from rough-cut lumber, which means it had been built on-site, from logs that had been cut and milled locally. Shelving made the same way, holding mason jars of preserved food. This wasn't a weekend camp. This was a long-term habitation. I walked through it slowly. The tents were closed, but not locked. I pulled back the flap of the nearest one. Inside, a sleeping pad, blankets, a lantern, and books. Stacked paperbacks, titles I didn't recognize, and a few hardcovers. A small wooden crate being used as a nightstand with a folded piece of paper on top. I should not have read the note, I know that. But I was alone in the middle of an unmapped section of national forest, standing in a camp that wasn't supposed to exist. And the piece of paper was right there. It was a list, not a letter. A list, written in neat, even handwriting. It read, Tuesday, perimeter check, north. Wednesday, water collection, both sources. Thursday, resupply expected. Friday, perimeter check, south. And at the bottom, underlined, if unfamiliar, leave. I put the note back. I backed out of the tent. I stood in the center of the camp and turned a slow circle, looking at the tree line in every direction. I was approximately 4 miles from the nearest trail and roughly 7 from the forest road where I'd parked. I had not told anyone specifically where within my grid I'd be working that afternoon. The phrase perimeter check is what had shifted everything. That's not camping language. That's a security protocol. I left. I'm not ashamed to say I moved quickly and didn't stop until I'd covered 2 miles back toward the trail. I filed a report with the Forest Service District Office the following morning, provided GPS coordinates, and asked them to investigate. A ranger was dispatched the following week. He found nothing. He reported that the location I'd identified contained no structures, no fire ring, no tents, and no evidence of habitation. Either the people at that camp moved everything, every heavy canvas tent, every jar of preserved food, the handmade wooden table, in the time between my report and the ranger's visit, or the ranger found it and reported nothing. I don't know which possibility disturbs me more.
Story 6. Wildlife survey work at night is different from anything else you'll do in the forest. You're intentionally dark. No lights, because lights distort movement patterns. You sit still at the edge of clearings for long stretches and let the night tell you what's there. You learn to read the sounds. You know what deer movement sounds like versus fox, versus raccoon, versus bear.
After enough nights out there, you can feel the difference. The meadow I was stationed at that night was about 3 acres of open ground in a bowl between 2 ridges, perfect for deer and turkey surveys. I'd been at the same position at the eastern tree line edge for about 2.5 hours. At approximately 1 in the morning, I became aware of something watching me from the opposite tree line. I can't explain how I knew. It wasn't a sound, it wasn't movement. It was a feeling that every person who spent significant time in dark forests will understand. The acute, specific awareness that something with intent is directing its attention toward you. I stayed still. I scanned the western tree line with my night vision monocular. There was a figure standing at the wood's edge, upright, human in shape, standing completely still in the gap between 2 large trees. I watched it for 2 full minutes without it moving. Then I slowly raised my hand radio and said that I was a Forest Service officer and asked the individual to identify themselves. The figure didn't move. I said it again. Nothing. After about 4 more minutes, the figure stepped backward into the trees and was gone. I crossed the meadow immediately and examined the tree line where it had been. The soil at the wood's edge was soft. There were boot prints, clear, deep, adult human, going into the trees. I followed them with my flashlight for about 60 feet until the ground became too rocky to track. No one came back. No sound of retreat through the forest. I reported the encounter. The investigating ranger noted that the location was popular with poachers who came out at night to spotlight deer, and attributed the figure to an illegal hunter who'd fled when identified as a law enforcement officer. That's a plausible explanation. It might even be correct. What the explanation doesn't account for is that when I crossed back to my original position and looked at the soil there, the soft ground where I'd been sitting for 2.5 hours, there were footprints that weren't mine. On the opposite side of my position from the clearing, deep in the trees behind me. Whatever had been watching me from the western tree line, something had been standing behind me the whole time.
Story 7. I was 6 weeks into my seasonal contract when they cleared me for solo overnight patrol. I was proud of that. I'd pushed hard to get cleared early, and my supervisor had signed off on it. I wanted to prove I was ready. Patrol Sector 7 in the Shenandoah covers about 12 trail miles through a heavily forested ridge system. You check fire rings, you look for illegal camping, you document wildlife sign, you make sure nobody's in distress. Routine. I was 4 hours into my shift, moving along the ridgeline trail, when my radio crackled. This part is important. We operated on 2 channels. Channel 1 was the primary dispatch frequency for my sector. Channel 2 was the emergency all stations frequency. I was monitoring Channel 1. The call came in on Channel 2. It was a voice giving coordinates, male, calm and clear, no distress in the tone, just stating coordinates in standard format, the way a trained person gives a position. I wrote them down immediately on my notepad. Then the voice said, "Do not search north of the Second Creek crossing. Acknowledge." Then static. I radioed dispatch on Channel 1 immediately. I reported an unidentified transmission on Channel 2, gave the coordinates, and asked if any unit had been broadcasting on emergency frequency. Dispatch confirmed that no units were on Channel 2. They asked me to repeat the coordinates. I did. There was a pause on dispatch's end, probably 15 seconds, and then the dispatcher told me to mark the transmission time and continue my patrol. She said someone would follow up in the morning. Her voice had changed. I noticed it at the time. She sounded like she was being very careful about what she said. In the morning, I gave a full statement. My supervisor reviewed it with me and a senior ranger I hadn't met before, a man named Garrett Hollins, who was apparently a district-level coordinator. They asked me to describe the voice. They asked whether the voice had said anything else. They asked whether I'd gone north of the second creek crossing. I hadn't. I'd continued my assigned route, which didn't take me north of the crossing anyway. They thanked me, told me the transmission was likely a signal bleed from an adjacent ranger district, and that the coordinates corresponded to a closed section of the forest. I accepted that. I was new. I didn't push. What I did afterward, on my own time, was look up the coordinates I'd written down. They corresponded to a section of the Shenandoah backcountry that, according to the trail map, didn't have a second creek crossing. The nearest creek crossing was nearly a mile from those coordinates. The instruction, north of the second creek crossing, didn't make geographic sense for that location. I sent Garrett Hollins a message asking about it. He never responded. I finished my seasonal contract in November and wasn't offered a renewal. My supervisor told me the staffing allocation had changed. She said it with the same flat, careful voice the dispatcher had used that night on the radio. I still have the notepad. The coordinates are still there, in my own handwriting, exactly as the voice gave them. I've never gone back to that section of the park.
Story 8. I've been building and maintaining backcountry trails for 11 years. I understand how trails work. They don't just change overnight. The ground doesn't move. Blazes don't relocate themselves. I am telling you this because I need you to understand that what I'm about to describe is not something I can explain, and I've spent a very long time trying. We'd been working a new connector trail in the Cherokee for 3 weeks. A half-mile section through a ridge saddle linking 2 existing routes. Standard work. Grading, drainage, blaze marking, the whole process. By the Thursday evening of the 3rd week, we had about 400 feet left to complete. I came back Friday morning to finish the section. The first thing I noticed was that the blazes on the last 200 feet of completed trail had changed. Not damaged, not faded, changed. The standard orange rectangles I'd personally painted on the trees were gone. No scarring, no residue, no sign they'd ever been there. In their place, on the same trees, at the same height, were different markings. Irregular shapes in a grayish-white material that I couldn't identify on sight. Not paint, not chalk. Something that had a texture, almost like it had been applied with fingers. I stood there for a long time, just looking at the first marked tree. Then I walked the trail back. The grading work we'd done, the cut edges, the drainage dips, the compacted tread, was there. The physical work hadn't been touched, but every single blaze had been replaced with these gray markings. Every one. Over 200 feet of completed trail. And then the trail ended. Not at the point where we'd stopped work the previous evening. The graded tread simply stopped, cleanly, at a point approximately 60 feet before where our Thursday work had ended. The last 60 feet of ground we'd cleared, the worked earth, the removed brush, the cleared vegetation, was gone. Grown back. Not overgrown in the way something grows back over months or years. Just present, as if we'd never touched it. I called my crew lead, a man named Dennis, and told him to come out and look. He arrived 40 minutes later, walked the section, and stood at the same clean terminus where the trail just stopped. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "When did we stop yesterday?" I told him, approximately 60 feet further in. He said, "I remember that too." We contacted the district office. They sent out a supervisor the following Monday. She walked the trail, examined the markings on the trees, and took photographs. She told us the markings were possibly a non-standard blaze system used by a local hunting club, and that the trail terminus discrepancy was probably a measurement error. Neither of those explanations held up. We have photographed documentation of our work from Thursday afternoon. The GPS trail our equipment logged shows clearly where the graded tread ended. Something removed 60 feet of completed trail work between Thursday evening and Friday morning. Something replaced every blaze we'd put on those trees with unmarked gray symbols. The district supervisor never sent us a written follow-up report. We finished the connector trail the following week, working quickly and leaving before dark every day. Dennis never mentioned it again. I think he was more scared than he let on. I still have the photographs from Thursday afternoon and the photographs from Friday morning. The same trees, the same trail. Two completely different realities, separated by 8 hours of night. Story 9. My dog's name is Coda. He's a 5-year-old Belgian Malinois with more field hours than half the human searchers I've worked with. He's found 11 people in 6 years, 3 of them alive. I trust him the way I trust my own hands. We'd been on the Allegheny search for 18 hours when Coda alerted in the wrong direction. The missing subject was a 14-year-old boy who'd separated from his family's campsite 2 days prior. We'd established a search grid working northeast from the last confirmed sighting point, a trail junction about 2 miles from camp. Coda had been working a scent article from the boy's sleeping bag. At hour 18, we were at the northern boundary of our assigned grid. Coda had been working a promising scent corridor, and I'd been feeling good about the direction we were moving. Then he stopped, turned 90 degrees west, and gave me his alert. Coda's alert is specific. Sit, focused stare, single short bark. It's not ambiguous. In 6 years, I have never had him give a false positive. West was outside our search grid. West was across a creek and up a steep ridge that our search coordinator had specifically assigned to a different team. A team that had already completed that section and found nothing. I radioed the coordinator and told her Coda was alerting west. She asked me to confirm. I confirmed. She told me to hold position and redirected another handler team to sweep the western ridge again. While I was waiting, I let Coda work the scent a little more. He moved to the creek bank and stopped, staring up the ridge on the far side. That's when I saw the man. He was standing at the top of the ridge, not moving, just standing there, looking down in our direction. The distance was maybe 300 yards, far enough that I couldn't make out his face clearly, but close enough to confirm he was an adult male, standing very still, watching us. We had a full personnel log for the search. Every team member was accounted for by radio. I called the coordinator immediately and told her there was an unaccounted individual on the western ridge. She radioed all units. Everyone checked in. Nobody was on the western ridge. By the time I looked back up the ridge, the man was gone. We found the boy 40 minutes later, on the western ridge, exactly where Coda had alerted, in a shallow ravine about 50 feet below the ridgeline. He was dehydrated and hypothermic, but alive. He told us he'd been there since the previous afternoon, too weak to call out, drifting in and out of consciousness. He told us something else. He said that sometime during the night, a man had come and sat near him. He said the man hadn't spoken, hadn't touched him, hadn't done anything except sit nearby. He said it made him feel less afraid. When I asked him what the man looked like, he described someone of average height, standing quietly. We accounted for every search team member's movements for the previous 24 hours. No one had been in that ravine. I don't know who the man on the ridge was. I don't know who sat with that boy through the night. I've spent a lot of time not knowing the answer to those questions.
The only thing I'm certain of is that Coda knew before any of us did. Story 10. I did 12 years in the Army before I took this job. I know how to observe. I know how to separate what I see from what I think I see. I am telling you this story precisely because I am not the kind of person who reports things he hasn't confirmed. The Daniel Boone National Forest has a series of elevated fire observation positions, not full towers, just cleared high points with good sight lines. I was stationed at one of them during a dry stretch in October, specifically watching for fire starts in the valley system to the north. The valley I was watching is approximately 4 miles wide and 8 miles long. There are no roads into it. There are no maintained trails into it. Access requires crossing 2 creek systems and ascending 2 ridges. There is no reason for anyone to be in that valley after dark. There is no reason for anyone to be in that valley at all without a permit. And the permit system for that backcountry zone averages about 9 users per year. At 2:20 in the morning, I counted 9 flashlights moving through the valley. They were moving in a loose formation, not a line, not a cluster, but spread across an area roughly a 1/4 mile wide, moving northeast at a walking pace, through terrain that, in daylight, would require careful footing. At 2 in the morning, in the dark, 9 people walking through that valley in loose formation was not something that had an innocent explanation. I radioed the district dispatch and reported 9 unaccounted lights moving through the restricted valley. Dispatch acknowledged and told me they'd contact the county sheriff's department. I watched those lights for 47 minutes. They moved consistently northeast, covering approximately 1.5 miles of valley floor. Then, one by one, they went out. Not all at once, one at a time, over the course of about 4 minutes, until there were none. No lights reappeared. No movement that I could detect with my binoculars. The sheriff's department did not respond that night. They told the district office the following morning that they hadn't had units available for a backcountry call with no confirmed emergency. The Forest Service dispatched 2 rangers into the valley the following afternoon. They found no evidence of 9 people having walked through that valley. No footprints in the creek mud. No disturbed vegetation. No camps, no trash, no fire rings. What they did find, and this was in the official report, which I've read, was one item at the far northeastern end of the valley in a small clearing. A single folding chair facing south, back toward the observation position where I'd been sitting all night. No explanation for the chair was ever established. It was logged as abandoned property, origin unknown. I asked to be transferred to a different observation assignment after that season. My supervisor approved it without asking why. I think he already knew. Story 11. I've done a lot of solo backpacking. 43 overnight trips over 8 years, including 4 solo through hikes of routes over 100 miles. I carry 2 maps. I carry a compass. I carry a satellite communicator. I do not get lost, and I do not make things up. Day 3 of my Shining Rock route, I found a cabin that isn't on any map. I know it isn't on any map because I have checked every available source since coming home. USGS Topo, Forest Service trail maps, the historical survey maps from the 1930s, the old USFS land records from when the wilderness was established in 1964. Nothing shows a structure at the location where I found it.
The location is approximately 1.3 miles south of the established trail, in a bowl-shaped depression between two rock outcrops. I'd gone off-trail deliberately to photograph a specific rock formation I'd seen in a historical photograph. The cabin was old. Not collapsed, not derelict, standing, structurally intact, but clearly not maintained for many decades. Hewn log construction, the kind that predates the National Forest designation. A single door facing east. Two small windows with no glass. I photographed it from the outside before entering. I always photograph everything. The interior was one room. Dirt floor, a stone hearth, a single wooden shelf on the north wall. On the shelf, 3 mason jars. The contents of 2 appeared to be soil, dark, fine-grained soil packed tightly into the jars with lids sealed with wax. The third jar was empty, except for a folded piece of paper. I did not touch the jars with the soil, but I opened the empty jar and took out the paper. It was old. The paper had yellowed, and the ink had faded, but was still legible. It was not a letter, and not a note. It was a list of dates, written in a column. The earliest date was 1931. The dates continued, irregular in spacing, up through, and this is the part I've gone over a dozen times, what appeared to be a date in the mid-2000s. If the paper was genuinely old, the later dates weren't possible. If it had been recently written on old paper, which is what I tried to tell myself, then someone had placed it there deliberately, in a cabin that no trail reached, that no map showed. I put the paper back. I photographed the shelf and the jars without touching them. I left. I submitted my photographs and GPS coordinates to the Forest Service Wilderness Office. The response I received, via email, said that my report was noted and that the historical cabin would be reviewed for addition to the structural survey database. That was 3 years ago. It has not appeared on any map or survey document I've been able to access. I've tried to get back to the GPS coordinates twice. Both times, the depression between the rock outcrops was there. The geography was identical to my photographs. But the cabin was not. Just the depression, just the rocks, just the trees. No structure, no shelf, no jars. Story 12. I've coordinated over 400 search and rescue operations in the Appalachian and Piedmont regions over 19 years. I understand time management in field operations at a level most people don't. I know what an hour feels like. I know how it moves differently in the dark than in the daylight, how it compresses during action and expands during waiting. I know how exhaustion distorts time perception. What happened to Team Bravo on the night of the 14th was not time distortion. We had 4 teams out that night, searching for a missing elderly man who'd wandered from a trailhead parking area. The forest in that section is not extreme terrain. Rolling slopes, moderate tree density, no significant elevation change. Conditions were clear. Temperatures were cold but manageable. Standard operation. At 10:47, Team Bravo, 3 people, led by a veteran volunteer named Jim Castillo, checked in from their assigned grid section. They confirmed position, reported no subject found, and said they were moving to the next grid cell. Standard check-in. Everything normal. At 11:52, Team Bravo checked in again. Jim's voice was different. Flat. He confirmed position and said they were continuing their grid sweep. 65 minutes between check-ins. Bravo was supposed to check in every 15 minutes. I raised Jim on radio immediately and asked him to confirm his last check-in time. He said 10:47. I told him that was 65 minutes ago. I asked him to confirm. There was a long pause. Then he said, "That doesn't track." I asked him to account for his team's movements over the previous hour. He gave me a brief account. Grid sweep north, pivot east, grid sweep south, pivot west. A standard box pattern. He estimated the time elapsed at approximately 20 minutes. I pulled the radio log. Their intermediate check-ins, which should have occurred at approximately 11:02, 11:17, and 11:32, were not there. 5 consecutive missed check-ins. The radio log showed exactly 2 Bravo contacts that night, 10:47 and 11:52. I sent Team Alpha to Team Bravo's last known position to make direct contact. When Alpha reached them, they reported that all 3 members of Team Bravo were physically present and appeared normal. No injuries, no confusion beyond what I'd already noted, no signs of medical distress. But all 3 of their watches showed 10:58. My radio log showed 11:54 when Alpha reached them. Nearly a full hour off. All 3 watches, all agreeing with each other, all disagreeing with base camp, with Alpha, and with the radio log. Jim Castillo submitted a written statement the following week. He wrote that the team had experienced what he described as a continuous, uninterrupted patrol with no gaps in awareness, no unusual events, and no explanation for the time discrepancy. He wrote that all 3 members had compared watches at the 10:47 check-in, and all were synchronized. The missing elderly man was found the following morning by a different team, nearly a mile outside the search grid, dehydrated but alive. I never filed a formal anomaly report for Team Bravo. There was no category for what had happened. Jim Castillo retired from volunteer search work the following spring. He told me at the time that he'd decided to take more time with his family. The last time I talked to him, a year later, I asked if he'd ever figured out what happened that night. He said no. Then he said, "Sandra, I've been doing this for 22 years. I know what an hour of patrolling feels like. 20 minutes is what that was. I'd swear that on anything you asked me to swear it on." I believed him. I still do. I've coordinated 200 operations since that night. I give every team GPS units with independent time logging now. I don't explain why, if anyone asks.